Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life.
Spoiler, it probably wouldn't save poor Bert's life, but you know what? Welcome to the Cold War, where the science is made up and nothing really makes sense. Which is a great way for a teacher to start a lesson by telling you that nothing really makes sense. So I'm going to try to do my best to kind of give you the ground rules of the Cold War and what it's all about. But you should be aware that historians today still debate, as historians often do, the root causes of the Cold War. Because, again, there are a series of contradictions here. For one thing, it's called a war, even though it's certainly not a war like the Second World War. It's a war that's kind of characterized more by inaction rather than action. It's also a much longer conflict. It lasts for over half a century. And basically, if you look at the core areas of division between the United States and its allies, pictured here in blue, and the Soviet Union and its allies, pictured here in red, it is that the United States and the Soviet Union came into conflict because of two basic sort of political and philosophical issues. One is that the United States sort of embraces this economic system of capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union embraces socialism. And remember that in capitalism, the means of production is owned by the private sector. In socialism, the means of production instead is owned by the public. And that's sort of on the economic spectrum. On the political spectrum, of course, the United States and its allies more or less sort of support the idea of democracy, which, if you remember your Andrew Jackson and your Woodrow Wilson, shouldn't come as any great surprise. And remember the Atlantic Charter. If you remember the Atlantic Charter, you know that that was also something that was sort of championed by the United States in World War II. On the other hand, the Soviet Union and its allies supported communism. And generally, again, I'm not going to spend too much depth here, but remember that theoretically in a communist society, it's the people who are really in charge, but in order to enlighten the people have to be prepared for the transition to a communist society, and that's going to require the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat. And remember that no communist society has really made the transition from the dictatorship of the proletariat to whatever communism actually looks like beyond that. And again, we've never actually gotten there. Anyway, it's kind of typical to view the Cold War as an ideological conflict, where the United States is wrestling with the Russian bear. And eventually, in and around 1989 to 1991, the forces of capitalism and democracy emerge victorious over socialism and communism. And you actually get one of those sort of great cinematic moments in world history where the symbol of basically, Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall collapses, which leads to the slow but steady integration of countries under the Soviet Union's control back into kind of the European community. And of course, the U.S. Pats the newly formed country of Russia on the back, and they walk into the sunset, and oh, wait, who's this guy? By the way, in case you don't recognize the face or the pectoral muscles, that is Russian President Vladimir Putin, and I'm sure that many of you are aware of the fact that relations between Putin and whoever is president of the United States ranges from ambivalence to outright hostility, and that's even on the best of days. And so one of the things that shirtless Vladimir Putin might tell us is that if you think of the Cold War as purely an ideological conflict, that nation states don't really matter. It's the ideas that nation states are championing that matters. You might sort of lose a key sort of piece of the puzzle. Because obviously relations between the US and Russia aren't great right now, and if we sort of dismiss the Cold War as an ideological conflict, we might miss some of the reasons why. So what this is to say is that in some respects, we are revising our understanding of the Cold War even to this day, where suddenly, this view of the Cold War as a conflict between capitalism and socialism and democracy and communism, that's being revised a little bit. Because there's another view, and that is you sort of have to take a look at it from the perspective of the Soviet Union. And by the way, obviously I'm going to be referring to the Soviet Union and Russia interchangeably. Just so we're on the same page, remember that the Soviet Union is a union of many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. But Russia is by far the largest and really the most important member state in that union. And so it's pretty typical to sort of use the term Soviet Union and Russia interchangeably, but technically Russia is slightly smaller than the Soviet Union was back in the day. But remember that the Soviet Union is still basically the nation of Russia. And even though communism is supposed to be this sort of totalitarian, or you could even say totalizing ideology, right? Communism is supposed to transform all parts of society. Communism is supposed to be, isn't really supposed to get into, ideas like nationalism or religion, but one of the things we kind of see is that despite how much the Soviet Union tries to distance itself from its own history, Russian history, the thing is that history has a way of catching up with you. So what the Soviet Union learns from history is this story. In the early 18th century, that's the early 1700s, by the way, Russia is on the verge of becoming a great power in Europe under Tsar Peter the Great, until this Swedish dude by the name of Charles XII takes a small, highly trained, and highly advanced army into the heart of Russia and almost destroys it. Russia manages to win by the hairs of its chinny chin chin, which is ironic because Peter the Great actually forced people to shave. That's another story. Then, following that, in the early 19th century, Russia, on the verge of becoming a great power, is invaded by Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military genius in human history who leads the greatest army in human history up until that point, the Grand Army. And really, Napoleon's Grand Army is only destroyed because of terrible supply management and logistics. In other words, the French army was terrible at catering for its troops. That did more damage than Russian bullets or military skill. And then, by the way, ironically, probably the most lackluster of the three guys I've talked about so far, Kaiser Wilhelm II actually does manage to successfully defeat Russia in a war, which leads, of course, to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And don't even get me started on this guy. what this is to say is that Russia's history, really dating back to all the way to the Mongols, has been one of constant fear and paranoia. Now, some of you are like, well, why is Russia afraid? Because, like, nobody can invade Russia. I mean, everybody who invades Russia is basically signing their own death warrant, from Charles the 12th all the way down to Hitler. If Napoleon couldn't make it work, then who can? Well, the Russians themselves, by the way, weren't too sure of that. All of these invasions devastate Russia, especially, and you guys have seen the casualty tallies of World War II. So even in these victories, Russia comes out sort of diminished in its triumph, not really strengthened. And again, you saw that in very clear demographic terms because the fact that Russia loses anywhere from approximately 20 to 35 million people. Again, estimates kind of fluctuate depending upon which historian you're talking to or reading. But the Russian view of history is, whether you're talking about the Russia of Peter the Great, Tsar Nicholas II, or the Russia of Joseph Stalin, is that whoever controls this real estate basically holds a dagger to your throat. And especially whoever controls the real estate in Eastern Europe is especially threatening. Napoleon Bonaparte launched his invasion of Russia from Poland. By the way, the armies of Hitler and Kaiser Wilhelm II also sort of launched the move into Russia from Eastern Europe. And so, from the Russian perspective, how interested are Russians in advancing communism in Eastern Europe, and how much is it that they're actually just worried about this territory coming under the control and influence of powers that are hostile to it? The Cold War kind of takes on almost religious undertones. Questions like, are you a communist? That starts to sound a little bit like, are you a crazy religious dissenter, like a Puritan? And certainly those religious comparisons were made by people at the time. The famous playwright Arthur Miller, by the way, writes a play that's called The Crucible, by the way, which is kind of a religious analogy between, the politics of the 17th century with the politics of the mid-20th century. But even though the Cold War does have a strong ideological component to it, that there were people who felt very strongly about the advancement of communism and socialism on the one hand, and free market capitalism and democracy on the other, we also have to remember that this is still a conflict between nation states. And if you think of it as a conflict between nation states, you see a sort of a surprising view of the Cold War. Based upon that view, the United States doesn't win the Cold War by demonstrating the superiority of democracy and capitalism, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Instead, the United States wins the Cold War in the 1970s, when it allies itself with the most hardcore communist nation of them all, Mao Zedong's China, and forms a pact against the Soviet Union. So before we talk about who wins the Cold War and why, let's talk a little bit more about what it is. So remember from period 7, because we sort of introduced the Cold War in period 7, that the Cold War is a geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the two countries don't fight directly. Instead, they get proxies or clients or allied countries to basically fight between one another. And the United States and the Soviet Union sort of supports them openly or sometimes on the down low. And we've just come out of the Second World War, in which we have a war that is the most over-the-top destructive war in human history, and now we have this war that seems to be simmering. And the question is why? And maybe some of you are probably thinking, well, it's because the Cold War is in reaction to World War II, right? That because of the destruction in the Second World War, there's this general interest in basically avoiding those types of conflicts in the future. And there is some of that, admittedly. One of the things we discover is that the United States and the Soviet Union, on the one hand, want to advance their own interest, but at the same time, they want to advance their interest without leading to war. And balancing those two things can be difficult. But the most salient, the most single important piece of information you need to know that explains why the Cold War doesn't turn hot is this: the atomic bomb. And remember that last time we talked about the fact that the atomic bombs that were dropped in World War II were basically just, they were nothing in comparison to the much more destructive hydrogen bombs that would be developed in very short order. Once you start to get the hydrogen bomb, not only could hydrogen bombs basically gut entire cities, but they could basically destroy the surrounding countryside. So the Cold War is dominated by the fact that any conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union will result in a nuclear exchange and possibly the elimination of human civilization as we know it. Not a big deal, right? So that's one of the reasons why hostilities are sort of confined to smaller, more local conflicts. But remember the end of World War II, the United States does have a brief period of a nuclear monopoly where only the U.S. has possession of the atomic bomb. But remember that the Manhattan Project has been infiltrated by Soviet spies. And so eventually, actually in 1949, the Soviet Union will test an atomic bomb of its own. And eventually, you also have the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, where you don't even need to fly an aircraft over the area that you want to bomb. You just basically attach a warhead to a rocket, and then you send it from your missile bases to the country that you're trying to attack, and you can basically end all of human civilization at the push of a button. So mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is probably the single most important thing to understand. And of course, if a war is going to result in the destruction of your country and basically most of human civilization, then that sort of deters conflict. And by the way, this is one of the weird things is that there are some political scientists who talk about the benefits of nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons have made conflicts between nuclear powers obsolete. Well, fingers crossed, right? But that does seem to be borne out because, as many of you know, as most of you know, hopefully all of you know, human civilization is not ended, and the Cold War never turns hot, debatably because of, the costs were just too great. That any potential interest that the United States or the Soviet Union had was vastly outweighed by, the potential fallout, see what I did there, of a nuclear conflict. So that being said, though, we also kind of have to go back to the point we were in 1945, because remember that the United States and the Soviet Union were wartime allies. And Britain and the Soviet Union certainly didn't get along, but there was this genuine kind of affection between FDR and Stalin. And in the American press, during the Second World War, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was transformed from this dictatorial sort of, communist version of Hitler into the character known as Uncle Joe. An uncle, of course he would be an uncle, right? Because uncles are crazy. They can do things that are inappropriate, but they're still part of the family. And that kind of gives you a sense of how Americans kind of viewed Stalin during this time period. But what we also see is that even though there are some important long-term reasons for the emergence of the Cold War, ideological differences between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the fact that the United States has just recently had, in the 1920s, a Red Scare over the fear of communist infiltration, the fact is that the U.S. still, by the end of the Second World War, was an ally of the Soviet Union. When the United Nations was formed and was really crafted by the United States, the Soviet Union, was a member of the UN Security Council. a member state that had veto powers over any matter raised in the Security Council. And so what you kind of get a sense is that the United Nations is created and designed at this point in time where nobody is seriously thinking about a possibility of a Cold War. There are some people who are thinking in those terms. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is thinking in those terms. But for the most part, FDR and later Harry Truman, they're not thinking of the Soviet Union as an adversary for the future. And after the end of the Second World War, the United States military, this enormous military machine that was built up over 4 years, is mothballed and demobilized, partially because of this idea that nuclear weapons have made conventional armies obsolete. And in fact, from a budgetary perspective, it's actually much cheaper to build nukes rather than, raise armies. You don't have to pay for a nuclear weapons, retirement plan, for example. You don't have to pay them veterans benefits. You don't really get a sense, at least in 1945, that the Cold War is just around the corner. So why does the Cold War actually emerge in the first place then? Well, one of the trippiest, craziest lessons that I can teach you guys is that history is important to understand history, which I understand sounds tautological and redundant, but hear me out. The people who live in history are affected by history and learn lessons from history. And if there is, if you're looking for the harshest teacher of all in history, it's probably been the Great Depression and the Second World War. And remember that both the United States and the Soviet Union learned very, very different lessons from that conflict. Remember that the Second World War for the United States was the ultimate repudiation of isolationism. That, if the United States basically, pieces out of global affairs, then the result is Adolf Hitler. So if you want to avoid Hitler 2.0, what do you have to do? Well, you have to stay involved. You have to do things like support the United Nations. You need to be a player in not only the global economy, but also you need to support the idea of international law and international institutions. You need to get more involved. And the United States is going to play a role that it's never really played before in global affairs because of that. But remember, the Soviet Union is, ends the war more paranoid than it's ever been. Where if you're looking at, the Soviet perspective, they're very, afraid of states that like to be interventionist and active on the global stage, because that was certainly Adolf Hitler. And as the U.S. starts to consolidate its influence in Europe after the Second World War, because again, the United States is the only country in the world that emerges economically unscathed by the Second World War. So much global manufacturing and production, it comes out of the United States. The Soviet Union is very, very wary of that because in some respects, the U.S. Not only looks like a new Germany, it looks even more sinister than Germany. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that Adolf Hitler offered the other countries of Europe is coercion. Join me or die is kind of the rationale there. But the United States has a very different way of exerting influence in Europe. The United States doesn't have to really leave troops in Europe. It doesn't have to sort of create an empire for itself like Napoleon does in the 19th century or Hitler does in the 1940s. It simply uses its pre-existing economic influence to get European nations to sort of ally with it. So what happens is that the Soviet Union looks at the United States as an even more imposing threat than Germany, arguably. On the other hand, there's this view that Stalin, again, is Hitler 2.0, and that as Stalin is consolidating his control in Eastern Europe by supporting communist governments, what that is just simply a cover for Soviet imperial ambitions. And remember that, from the Soviet perspective, yes, Stalin did promise free and fair elections in Central and Eastern Europe, and Stalin certainly reneged on those promises. But from Stalin's perspective, arguably this was necessary because otherwise the Soviet Union might be bordered by states that are hostile to it. So by the end of World War II, and a little bit afterwards, you do see elections throughout Eastern and Central Europe in those countries that the Soviet Union has liberated. And, wouldn't you know it, all of those countries report resounding victories by the Communist Party. And so it looks like the Soviet Union is using communism as a way to sort of expand its own influence. And this is where it gets kind of, confusing, because remember that the Soviet Union was a communist state, and during the 1920s especially, it supported the idea of worldwide communist revolution. And so the idea is that if you export communism abroad, then these new countries in Eastern and Central Europe will kind of look to the Soviet Union as its protector and big brother. So in response to this, a U.S. State Department official by the name of George Kennan writes a very influential article called The Long Telegram. Fortunately, you don't have to read all of it, but you should know kind of the basics of it. Kennan, who is basically a specialist in Russian history and criminology, by the way. Criminology, by the way, was actually an area of study. Basically, it refers to, the study of the Soviet government. And apparently, back in the day, back in the Cold War, you could actually get that as a major. So anyway, George Kennan basically theorized that the Soviet Union would seek to expand its influence by supporting communist and democratic socialist groups in Western governments. And so the idea is that as communist and democratic socialist groups would gain power and prominence, that the Soviet Union would use that influence to basically get those countries to do what it wanted. So this is one of the reasons why we see the beginnings of the Red Scare, because of this thought that, being a communist isn't simply just about somebody's personal political ideology. No, if you're a communist, you are, by definition, somebody who is a pawn of the Soviet government. So note the thought process here. The idea is that any growth of communism abroad has to come because of Soviet support. And if we're looking at the law of averages, that was more or less kind of true, but there's also that fallacy of the hasty generalization, where you assume that because most communist revolutions are backed by the Soviet Union or, come from the Soviet Union, that all of them do. And this hasty generalization gets the United States into some trouble. If anybody's ever heard of the Vietnam War, which we'll cover extensively a little bit later, that's kind of the plug for that. But, that being said, with the Long Telegram, as early as 1946, we begin to see U.S. foreign policy specialists, express skepticism towards the Soviet Union's interest, and accuse or talk about the Soviet Union as kind of being two-faced. That being said, though, we also start to see conflicts between the U.S. and the Soviet Union sort of expand during this same time period. So, like we said, the Soviet Union did support communist movements, especially in Europe, but generally throughout the world. And really, you see that especially in what's kind of called the Balkans. Which kind of comprises modern-day Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, basically this area right here. The area that was so much fun in World War I. Now, one of the things that happens during this time period is that a number of these states experience a civil war that sort of overlaps with World War II, which typically sort of pitted communist versus non-communist forces. So the most noteworthy example of this is Greece. So in World War II, the British basically gave the non-communist Greek government a lot of direct military and political aid. But the British government after the Second World War is basically broke. It's broke partially because of all the Lend-Lease aid that it's had to depend upon. But the fact is that the British Empire, which was probably the most ardently anti-communist force before the United States, just doesn't have the muscle to support a civil war in Greece. And by the way, one of the things we kind of see is that after the Second World War, there's this assumption that the British have that the world is basically going to be divided between three great powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. As it actually happens, though, it takes a while for the truth to kind of set in. The British government just is too bankrupt to really wield that kind of power and influence. So the British kind of passed the torch on to the United States. In a series of diplomatic telegrams, the British asked the Truman administration if there's anything they can do to help stem this Soviet aid, defeat or at the very least provide enough aid to the Greek government to suppress this communist insurgency. Now, again, if you take the view that the Cold War is an ideological conflict between democracy and communism, the Greek Civil War is going to be confusing, because in the Greek Civil War, President Truman authorizes millions of dollars worth of aid to the new Greek government that was fighting the communists, even though the Greek government was not democratic. In fact, the Greek government was basically a military dictatorship. And to a certain extent, if you're fighting communists, well, military dictatorships are kind of efficient, right? You don't have to worry about legislatures sort of making up their minds. Military dictatorships are good at making the trains run on time. Unless you're Mussolini. He really wasn't good at making the trains run on time. But yeah, otherwise, if you're fighting a war, there is something to be said for, the efficiency that military dictatorships provide. So think about this. What this kind of means is that the United States, in the very opening of the Cold War, is supporting a non-democratic government to defeat a communist one, so that we can resist communist totalitarianism. But, other forms of totalitarianism are okay, I guess. And, it's easy to kind of point out all of these sort of hypocrisies and, all the ridiculousness of it. But the fact is that this aid given to the Greek government is ultimately what stems the tide. And also, around the same period of time, the Soviet Union was demanding passage through basically the Dardanelles Straits, which is basically, it runs right through Turkey. And Turkey certainly did not want to give the Soviet Union access through the Dardanelles, and it requested U.S. Basically military aid, so that it could, basically put in a little bit more iron into its diet. And so eventually, because of this extra aid, again, the Greek Civil War results in a communist defeat, and Turkey does not open its straits to the Soviet Union. And the reason why the United States finds itself intervening in, another country's civil war, or, basically Turkish maritime waterway rights, is because of the idea that if you let communism advance, it's going to produce a domino effect. And this is what you call domino theory, that if you allow communism to take hold, then kind of like a virus, it's eventually going to spread. So in other words, you kind of have to adopt a zero tolerance policy. And there's a couple of examples, a couple of very dramatic examples that we can use to kind of show why there was such, conviction on this point, that communism is not just something that stays where it is, but is something that eventually spreads like an epidemic. Kind of like an epidemic, what Truman proposes with the Truman Doctrine is that the United States should try to quarantine communism, or contain it, is the word that's used. Now, that being said, the Soviet Union also has advantages that it can play. So one of the advantages that it has is the fact that Berlin, the former capital of the German Reich, is a city that is jointly occupied by US, French, British, and Soviet forces. But it also is in the middle of the Soviet zone of control. So what that meant is that if you wanted to get to Berlin, you had to pass through the Soviet zone of control. And this gave the Soviet Union a wild card. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had a way of expressing things very memorably and flamboyantly, would say, Berlin is the, insert vulnerable part of the male anatomy here, of the West. Whenever I have something I want, all I have to do is squeeze until it squeals. So the idea is that the Soviet Union could apply pressure on Berlin if it wanted to signal its displeasure with something. And so Joseph Stalin decides to kind of test the waters here, and he cuts off Berlin by road. And, according to Stalin, it's not a big deal. The fact is that Berlin and the area around Berlin is in urgent need of roadway repair. So all roads going to Berlin are going to be closed for months. And I know that we joke about, roadway construction today, but, this is kind of taking things to a next level. I guess this is one of those things where everybody is a supervisor, but nobody is really working on the roads. So the thing is that Berlin is now completely cut off by land, which also includes, how are you going to feed the people of in the British, American, or French zones of control? Nobody really knew. Is the United States going to have to ask the Soviet Union for aid or help? So what happens is that Harry Truman organizes this massive resupply by air, where aircraft that used to be bombers in World War II are suddenly retasked with, instead of dropping bombs, dropping food packages. And you almost have these, in what's called the Berlin Airlift, you have these absurd images of school kids running gleefully behind American bombers as they drop boxes of, chocolates and candy and that kind of thing. And eventually what happens is that the Soviet Union, after a few months, is forced to admit that, admit defeat. The roads are reopened. And of course, this is kind of seen as a symbolic victory for the United States, where the United States is able to demonstrate its industrial and economic might. But this is, it's kind of weird that we're talking about these as being the opening battles of the Cold War, because in the last war we talked about opening battles like the invasion of Poland and France. But these are the types of battles that we kind of see in the Cold War, where there's a lot of politicking that goes on behind the scenes. And these are also battles that are designed to be very symbolic, to symbolize the strength of communism or socialism on the one hand, and democracy or capitalism on the other. Symbolic or not, these early battles of the Cold War clearly signify that things are heating up. And so, partially in response to the Berlin Airlift, you begin to see the nations in what we can call the Eastern Bloc, states that are allied to the Soviet Union, begin erecting barricades and walls to prevent people from entering or leaving. And of course, the most famous of these barricades is called the Berlin Wall. Which actually divides the city of Berlin into two, the Soviet zone of control and the non-Soviet zone of control. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, that Berlin is kind of a symbol of the Cold War, and why the Berlin Wall falling during the Cold War is kind of seen as the symbolic victory of the United States over the Soviet Union. But this is something that was famously noted by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was invited to speak at a graduation address in Fulton, Missouri, at the University of Missouri. And usually, by the way, graduation addresses are, seniors, for those seniors who are listening, what you're supposed to get is like a nonpartisan go-get-'em type speech, right? Something that's supposed to make you feel good, like you can conquer the world. It is supposed to be about you. But that's not what Churchill does. Churchill gets up there and says, "From Stettin to Trieste, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Basically, saying that we almost see, it's almost using language that's a throwback to the pre-war years of the 1930s, before the British and the Germans fought World War II. And by the way, this speech by Churchill, basically calling the Soviet Union out for its increasingly authoritarian practices, was not well received by the Truman administration, because the optics of this looked terrible. It looked as if the United States government was inviting Winston Churchill to give a speech on U.S. soil to condemn the Soviet Union. And that's certainly how things were perceived in the Soviet Union itself. This is an example of, not the last example to be sure, of how things in the Cold War sometimes spin out of control. Now, the other thing that was not exactly viewed with favor is something we've already kind of talked about in Period 7, and that is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is, I'm going to briefly summarize it here because we've already talked about it, but the idea is that the United States is going to basically invest some $13 billion in aid, and it's earmarked for Europe. And the thing is that, most European countries were eligible for aid in the Marshall Plan, whether that you're talking about Western or Eastern European nations, including Eastern European nations under the control or influence of the Soviet Union. And several countries, most notably Czechoslovakia, signaled that they were very interested in receiving some of that Marshall Plan funding. And what happens is that the Soviet government puts pressure on Eastern European governments to refuse Marshall Plan aid. And the reason being is that the Soviet Union thought of the Marshall Plan as basically a front for U.S. imperialism and U.S. influence. That if you allow Marshall Plan funding to enter Eastern Europe, then it's going to basically be at the expense of Soviet influence. So the Marshall Plan, which I'm not going to say that it was wholly altruistic, but and it did it was intended to, in some respects, suppress communism, but it was more intended to suppress communism in Western European nations, particularly France and Italy, that had growing and powerful communist parties. The idea is that if people are happy because people are well off, then they're not going to have much interest in, supporting or joining extremist political parties. But this is yet another example of how, to a certain extent, the Soviet Union and the United States sort of misinterpret the other's intentions. But these conflicts so far have been fairly passive-aggressive and limited in scope. Again, conflicts more that revolve more around symbolism rather than bullets or bombs. Next time, we'll talk about an example of when the Cold War actually turns hot.